So this gift from Gwendolyn may take hours to take place, but we're being filmed in my living room in San Diego. Whenever you see this, I have no idea where you'll be. My parents were the children of immigrants, so I am a second-generation American. My father was Dutch. His family was from the Netherlands, from an area called Groningen. A lot of people say that Holland is the name of the country, but indeed it's not. It's really a section of the Netherlands that's Holland. And Groningen is way up in the north, possibly close to the German border. And my grandfather was kind of a simple man, kind of a tradesman, and nothing spectacular about him. But my grandmother, my father's mother, for whom I am named, and for my granddaughter Gwendolyn is also named, Gwendolyn Grace. Gretchen is the Dutch name for Grace. And her family was upper middle class. She and her three sisters were educated. Two of them were teachers. They all played the piano and the organ, and their father owned a general store. I know nothing much about the Toppin mother, but I do know about the father. And he was a kind man and had a very successful business. But in the late 1800s, 1900, a major depression took over all of Europe, and he was giving credit to people who could not pay cash for whatever they were buying from his general store. The depression got so serious that he eventually lost his store. So his solution was, we're going to move to America. And they sold everything but the piano and the organ, and packed up their daughters, and he bought second-class tickets on a ship to New York. Now, if you happen to have seen the movie Titanic, you'll understand those people in steerage were most of them who didn't survive. But those people in first and second class got to dress for every night for dinner and eat very elegantly, and the Toppin family did just that. I hear the story that my grandmother Grace was offered something called iced cream for dessert, and she thought that sounded pretty awful and refused it. But her sisters accepted, and they kept saying, Gretchen, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. So finally, the last night on the trip, she tasted the ice cream and loved it. But by the time she reached America, they could no longer afford to get it. As a result of that, when I was raising my children, that's Aaron, Kelly, and Douglas, I always said, you've got to taste it just once. At any rate. So the Toppins disembarked from the ship in New York City, while everybody else in steerage had to go to Ellis Island to go through immigration. And from there, they made their way to Chicago, as did my grandfather, John Peterson. And they all ended up near lots of other Dutch people in Chicago. Mom, on the other hand, now remember, these are Dutch reformists, very conservative, very religious, were very anti-Catholic because of the time that the Netherlands lived under the rule of Spain. So they have prejudices. They didn't smoke, they didn't drink, none of that. Along comes my mother, Rosie, from Westerly, Rhode Island, the daughter of two immigrant Italians. My grandmother, Rose, was this little short, fat, chubby Italian woman that I only met like 3 or 4 times in my entire life. She came from a village called Acri in Calabria in the south of Italy. Very, very poor. Turns out that Antonio Giancarello, the man she ended up marrying, also was from the same village. On one of our trips to Italy, John and I visited that village, and we saw the Giancarello name on a plaque, donating an organ or something from all those people from Westerly, Rhode Island. So I know the family was from the same village. She immigrated legally. He came through Canada, as I understand, and just kind of worked his way down to Rhode Island. That particular time in history was the greatest migration of Italians from Italy to the United States. They were the new big minority. Not treated well, not accepted well, but they came in great numbers. Well, my grandparents ended up marrying. He was younger than my grandmother a little bit. But in their years of marriage, which was short, maybe 12, 15 years, he fathered 10 children. My mother was the second oldest of the 10. And the odd thing is that he didn't have a real job. Half of the year he lived in Westerly and he made money for the family. They had bought a little farm and he cut up wood to sell as firewood. The other half of the year he was always in New York City, nobody knowing what he did for sure. But what we did learn upon his death, which was from gangrene because he had blood poisoning and refused to allow them to cut off his arm, he was a member of something called the Black Hand. That is the forerunner of the Cosa Nostra and the mafia that we understand it to be today. I think it was more common for Italian immigrants to do dishonest things. Call it in the bloodline, I don't know. But at any rate, that's what he did. But when he died, my mother's oldest sister, Margaret, ran off and got married and left my mother, the second oldest of 10 children, to quit school in the 8th grade to support the family. Something you need to know about my mom. She was born prematurely. She was due at the end of October, but her birthday is the 21st of August. So she came 2 months early, and in the time, they didn't have incubators. My grandmother thought she had to go to the bathroom, went out to the outhouse, and started to deliver my mother, so she runs back in the house, and somebody screamed, my Aunt Marge, or somebody in the neighborhood, called for the midwife, and they delivered my mom at home. She was so small that they were sure she wouldn't survive. So they made a bed for her out of a shoebox and pumped, in the middle of summer, pumped up the potbelly stove and created something like an incubator for her. She survived. She was very small. I mean, I would imagine between 3 and 4 pounds, but as history took it, she kept down getting smaller and smaller until she said, oh, I only weighed 1 pound when I was born. And so at any rate, I think one of the reasons my mother was the nicest one of all those 10 children, she was kind and loving, was that she was too small to suckle and could not nurse. So my grandmother pumped her milk into a dish, and all the neighbors came in and used an eyedropper to feed my mother. They held her and nurtured her. So she had lots of love and affection as an infant that I think ultimately made her who she was. So anyhow, Mother had to work. She went to work in a silk mill, and her next youngest brother did the same. My Uncle Jack, they had to drop out of school, but they lived in abject poverty. At the back door, these 2 men showed up, and they said, we're from the Black Hand. And said to my grandmother, your husband, Antonio, owes us $2,000. Well, you have to understand that $2,000 in 1922, something like that, would be like about a couple $100,000 today. And you have to pay us or else. So she mortgaged the farm, and the Depression made it so awful that she ultimately lost the farm. And the kids had to work, my mom had to work, and my mother stayed unmarried and worked and supported the family until she was 21 or 22. And then she met my father. And so my dad was Marine, And he was the bus driver for the Marine Corps' basketball team, and they were having a dance after a basketball game against the Navy in Groton, Connecticut. And he met my mom at the dance. And so that's how they met and married, and that is the historical background of their families. So they got married, and the night that they got married, my mother stood watch with my dad in the guardhouse, and he was then discharged the next day. He left for Chicago and said, "I will send for you when I get settled." But he didn't. 1 month went by, 2 months went by, and my mother was getting nervous about it. So she pulled together some money for a bus ticket and went to Chicago and presented herself at the door of the Petersons in the house on 62nd Place in Inglewood, which is in Chicago and is today known as the murder capital of the world. Horribly back, dangerous place. But they were living in the house that my grandfather, Peterson, had bought after his 1906 trip to San Francisco. After the earthquake, he made a lot of money in construction. And he and his two brothers. So my grandfather bought that house and the house out in Mount Greenwood. Well, his two brothers actually used their money, one to buy a chicken ranch and the other to buy an orange grove in a place called Redlands, California. And that established the family in Southern California that the rest of us migrated to as the years went by. So Mom and Dad are married, and the family's not so sure about the Dutch people are not so sure about my mother. Number one, she was supposedly Catholic. But my mom, in her rage with the Catholic Church after her father died, got very angry that they would not help them financially, but instead said to my grandmother, "You need to donate because it's better to give than it is to receive." At which point, my little 4'8" mother turned the priest around and shoved him out the back door and swore at him and said, "I'll never set foot in a Catholic church again as long as I live." So she actually wasn't a Catholic, but these Dutch anti-Catholics thought she was. And she had a sister who was divorced, supposedly, and that's a real no-no. We're talking, late 30s, because they got married in 1937. And she smoked. So she was all the things that they thought was pretty awful. But somehow she just sort of integrated herself in the family, and they accepted her. My father's two sisters, Elizabeth, whom we called Aunt Bess, and Cornelia, whom we call Aunt Babe, they finally just kind of liked her. And they were both married, and so life went on, and the Second World War occurred when I was it was December 1941, so I was about a year and a half, and things changed. My dad had a hard time finding jobs anyway. He had been a streetcar conductor. He had been a fireman on a locomotive train where he shoveled the coal into the fire to create steam, to create the power for the train. And he created a business. It was called the Lily White Bleach Company. Probably people would think that was racist today. But he and my mom made soap and bottled bleach, and my dad went door to door, kind of like a floor brush salesman, creating a clientele. And they did that together. They built the business, but then my mom became pregnant with me, and it got to be really difficult for her. And so when I was a newborn child, she was still trying to help him in the basement, but it was very difficult for her. The odor was, I'm surprised at her brain damage, actually, because she helped him. And at any rate, she said, we can't do this anymore. So after the Second World War occurred, my father decided that he would re-enlist in the Marine Corps. He had been in the Marines when he met my mother, as you recall, And it's back when the Marines had the theme, just a few good men. So it wasn't easy. But his experience as a 15-year-old riding the rails for a year as a hobo had toughened him up after he ran away from home, after his mother died. And so he was in it, he got admitted to this special program that enabled him to work his way into the Marine Corps, where he really distinguished himself as a marksman. And, but he was so patriotic that he felt he needed to re-enlist. But he was too old to be drafted, and he was a father. So he went to the Navy, lied about his age, lied about being a father, and they said, you need to be in the Marine Corps, not in the Navy. So they re-enlisted him into the Marine Corps. So then he got shipped out, and that left me and Mom alone, living with the downstairs of my grandfather's house while my cousins and aunt and uncle, Aunt Bessie and Uncle Otto DeYoung, lived upstairs. So what happened was that my mom had her sister Marge, who had supposedly run off and gotten married and had gotten divorced, and her daughter, Marlene, lived with us during the war. And my mom and their friends, the women used to smoke and drink and play pinochle in the kitchen, and they all had jobs, and my mom was working in the defense industry, and I was totally surrounded by very strong female images. And I think that's part of where my leadership qualities developed. And so my dad came home on leave, and my mom got pregnant. And 9 months later, my brother Rick was born. His name was Richard Allen Peterson. And he used to be Rich or Richie, but as he became a teenager, he became Rick. And so then my dad was discharged, 46 or so after the war, came home, and the first thing he wanted to do was to buy a car. And this Jewish man who had been his friend, he had a jewelry store up around the corner, because where we lived in Inglewood was, there was like a big Sears and Roebuck store and Awards and lots of stores, and this Jewish man, whose name I can't remember now, but he and my dad became friends. He counseled my father and said, don't buy a car, buy a house. You live in that house and you stay there, then you save money, then you buy another house and you move and you rent your place. And my dad said, nah, I want a car. And he later in years used to tell that story. But my mom learned the lesson. So long about the time that I'm 7 years old, this is quite a changing neighborhood. There's actually a lot of poor white trash moving into that part of Chicago, and somewhat of a white flight. And so my dad became a cement finisher, and so he had a trade. And my mother, without his consent, bought us a house in Mount Greenwood. And my father was rather shocked and didn't know how to get out of the deal, but it turned out to be financially a very wise thing. So she was the real estate person. And we lived in Chicago. My grandfather, Peterson, used to spend summers with us, and he would go to California in the wintertime to live with his daughters, Aunt Bessie, Aunt Bam, and Aunt Babe in Redlands, California. By then, they had their own children. Bessie had Buddy and Grace, another Grace, and John, and my Aunt Babe had Hank and Phyllis and Bob. So I ended up having cousins at last. And we used to go to Redlands a great deal, all of our Christmas holidays and such. So after my mom accepted this real estate deal to buy this house in Mount Greenwood, it looked like it was time to move. And we did. The house they bought was this big old brick house that had been constructed using all the bricks that used to line the streets where the streetcars used to come in from Chicago. So it had a historical significance.
And Grandpa Peterson stayed with us in the summer. And then all of our family started to move to California. The Batcheses moved with Hank and Phyllis and Bob, and then the DeYoungs moved, and they all settled in Redlands. So my brother Rick was a very sickly child and was in the hospital a lot with very severe asthma. And the doctor said, you have to move to a hot, dry climate. Well, that did it. We had to leave Mount Greenwood and our big house, and the only used bike I'd ever owned. We had to leave it behind. And my dad bought a brand new 1951 Studebaker, and we drove to California. So we arrived in Redlands, and turns out everybody was camping out in the mountains, and so we drove up into the mountains. And the first thing that I remembered about California was the smell of pine trees, and it was just so wonderful. And my cousins were all at some church camp, but my aunt had been in this cabin, and that was my first memory of California. But jobs weren't plentiful in that part of California, so my dad heard that San Diego was a booming place. My mother's Aunt Marge, who had gotten married to a Marine officer, and they relocated to San Diego after he was discharged from the military, and they invited us to come stay with them for a while. So we moved to San Diego, stayed in Creme Point with my aunt and uncle, and Mom and Dad went out and bought this new tract house in a place called Brookside, and the brook was really nothing but a ditch. And so I started 6th grade in Lemon Grove Junior High when we moved into that house. And in my 6th grade class, there was a girl named Mary Connolly. And that's where we weren't friends. She was very horsey. She had a horse. And we knew each other and everything, but we weren't friends. She lived some other part of Lemon Grove. Well, because after the Second World War, the military people started having babies like mad. And so all the school systems were really impacted, and they were just growing like mad. So I was on a half-day school day at the Lemon Grove Junior High when it was decided that where I lived, I should go to La Mesa Junior High. So my 6th and 7th grade years were in Lemon Grove. Then in the 8th grade, I went to La Mesa, which happens to be the same school that all my children ended up going to. And from there, I went to Helix High School. And again, everything was growing so fast that they said, oh, you have to go to another high school. If you can get yourself to Helix, you can stay. If you have to take a school bus, you have to go to Grossmont, which was absolutely the best thing that ever happened to me because I fit into that environment so well. It's where my leadership qualities really evolved. And I started losing weight and getting tall and looking different, and had really a successful 2-year period of time. But then they decided they were going to build a new high school called Mount McGill. They were going to take half of the senior class from Grossmont and half from Helix and put us together. And I was reunited with Mary Conley. As a result of that, we both became student body officers. Well, Mary said, I need to introduce you to my brother. So she had told me about this brother who was really into classical music and stuff. And so I went over to Mary's house in Lemon Grove to work on a project for our new school year that was going to begin. And this must have been early July or so. And I heard this classical music. And I said, oh, is that the brother Roger you want me to meet? She said, are you kidding? Roger's into rock and roll. That's my brother Bill. So anyhow, she said, you need to meet Roger. So her boyfriend was a guy named Dick Cook at the time, and we had a double date, and I met Roger Conley, and I was quite smitten, quite honestly. He was just an absolute gorgeous guy. He had a beautiful blue Merc, lowered and tucked and all that stuff that in the happy days were important. And he was going to be going to Riverside Community College to play basketball for this guy who became very famous. Jerry Tarkanian or something like that. I don't quite remember. But so we started going steady, and I was in the marching corps, and I was a student body officer, and I was in the choir, and I was very busy. But every Wednesday, Roger would drive down to see me on Wednesdays. So that kind of said he was sort of smitten too. And so luck have it, he hurt himself playing basketball and couldn't complete the semester. So the next year he came back to San Diego State, which he's got kicked out of twice before. And he was a journalism student. And we thought that we would write the great American novel together. His writing was really good. I don't know how mine was. I was a halfway decent student, actually, and real popular and all that stuff, but decided that wearing his basketball on my chain and going steady was kind of a cool thing to do. And so anyhow, he's at San Diego State, where actually he had been the sports editor and the editor of the Daily Aztec, the college newspaper. And then when he came back, he again became the sports editor. Well, we decided that, I don't know why we did this. This is a puzzling thing. We decided we were going to get married. We'd gone to his sister Leah's wedding and I think caught the disease. Yeah, so this is 1957 that we went to his sister's wedding, and I think maybe I got the bug there. But anyhow, in 1958, we decided we would get married. He said, I had been working a few afternoons a week for my family dentist, and so he said, you have experience and you can get a job. I have a job. I could get a job as a copy boy at the Tribune or the Union because of his journalism background. And then I'll get my journalism degree, and when I'm done, you can go back to school and get your degree. Sounded like a really great idea, right? Well, he got the journalism career, and I got the baby. We got married in August of 1958, and we had this really wonderful first year. We bought a sports car, and we were just living the life that was lots of sports and friends and stuff. And then I became pregnant with Aaron about a year later, just when Roger was getting his draft notice to go into the military. Well, because I was pregnant, he suddenly had a deferment. And simultaneously, he had been working part-time sort of for the Tribune, doing stuff in sports. And the Tribune, which is, the Union and the Tribune were the daily newspaper in San Diego, decided that it wanted to have a full-force high school sports section. So they hired Roger and a guy named Rick Smith to be their prep writers. And Roger was talking to his advisor at San Diego State, who said, you can't learn anything more from me. You already know, you're a journalist through and through. So he accepted the job and quit college. So at any rate, then I was pregnant with Aaron, and Roger was working as a sports writer, happy as he could be. Aaron was born on the 10th of May of 1960. Coincidentally, I read 30 years later in the newspaper that today is the 30th anniversary of the introduction to the birth control pill, which I thought was pretty funny. So I remember cut out the article and sent it to Aaron and said, boy, are you lucky. So that's kind of what happened in the 50s and 60s. Family planning wasn't as defined as it is today. But she was a very difficult child, baby. She had a horrible reaction to milk and formula and had a lot of medical problems as a little kid, little baby. But once she was about 4 months old or so and could sit up straight, she was happy. I remember we lived in this apartment, and it was August of 1960. I had not gone back to work yet for this dentist that I worked for, Dr. Austin, and we were sitting on the floor, she in her little baby seat, and me, and we're watching the Democratic convention when John F. Kennedy was being nominated. And Barbara Streisand was singing Happy Days Are Here Again, and I fell in love with Barbara Streisand, who became my most favorite singer of all time. And Erin was with me. And so, anyhow, I went back to work very shortly, and she was so unhappy. Roger would pick her up from work, and she'd scream her head off and all the way home till I walked through the front door, and then she'd go, "Oh." So we decided it might be best if I didn't work. And so what we did do, though, was buy a house. And it was out in a place called Casa de Oro, and it was on a very large lot. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, $17,200. But $399 moved you in. I mean, it was heaven. And we fixed it up and put up a fence and a patio. And then Kelly was born in January of '63 in that house. And so it was really just a lovely thing. Well, Roger was getting ambitious and was wanting to further his journalistic career and wanted to work what he claimed to be a real newspaper, a big city newspaper. And he got a job with the Chicago Daily News. And we left San Diego and moved to Chicago and relocated in a place called Park Forest, which were some of the happiest years of our lives. He was happy, I was happy, and then I got pregnant again, and we had Doug, who was he was 9 pounds. He was a hard baby to deliver for me. But he was just a wonderful child. He was kind of like our love child, and I have this wonderful story to tell. Roger, I want to back up on this because one of the things that happened while we were in Chicago in Park Forest was they had the storm of the century. Well, Roger had just changed our license plate from California to Illinois, and it was like at the end of January of what year was it? 67. And we had a little barbecue on a hibachi to kind of celebrate. And it started to snow the next morning, and Roger was working nights, luckily, because during the day it snowed so much that the train stopped. 27 inches of snow fell in a day. That's over 2 feet. Nothing moves in 2 feet of snow. And but it was one of the highlights for us. We were these crazy Californians. We thought it was fun. Everybody else in the neighborhood thought it was a problem. And so we dug ourselves out. But then shortly after that, I became pregnant with Doug, who was born in January of '68. And Roger was delighted to have a son, obviously. And so our time in Park Forest were just magical years. We loved it. The trees. We lived in what had been a forest preserve that they carved out just enough spaces for houses, but left all the big elm and oak trees. And so we decided to buy a house, and we bought a house just a block away. And we were there for about a year. And Roger got a job offer back in San Diego from a public relations company called Phillips Ramsey. So he decided for his career, and that was probably a good thing, a good move. So he moved back to San Diego, and I hated it. I missed Park Forest dreadfully, and I really had come into my own in Park Forest. I was 26 when we moved there. I was almost 30 when we got back to California. I had these 3 wonderful children. they had great lives, they were doing well in school. And I didn't want to go, but we did. And when the Chicago Daily News got back to Roger after relocating to San Diego saying, please come back, we'll pay all expenses, et cetera, but they would not give him the title of section editor, and he wanted that. And he also said, our children will be able to attend California universities far cheaper than they could in Illinois. Ha ha. So we stayed, and we bought this house in Lemon Grove, a cute little 3-bedroom, 2-bed bath house on a place called Lemon Lane. And luck be have it, this family moves across the street, the Lynn family. And Marilyn became my best friend. The children become each other's best friends. We had that really idyllic, happy days existence when wives didn't have to work and there was plenty of money. But I became a political activist and got really into local politics and was suddenly being very successful at running campaigns out of my garage. And one thing led to another, and I got a campaign that actually paid me to. And at that point, we had moved to La Mesa, and so that Aaron and the other kids could go to Helix High School. And I got an offer to run this campaign when I had been very interested in helping this woman named Lucille Moore become a county supervisor. And I was involved in her campaign a little bit when I got this offer to run a campaign for a Republican woman running for the same office. So I called Lucille Moore and said what had happened, and she said, talk her out of running and get her to join us. But if you cannot, accept the offer, Gracie, and learn as much as you can. And then in the fall, after, and the general election, come back. Well, son of a gun, that happened. I ran a very good campaign for Cheryl Briggs. I also got my neighbor across the street elected to the school board and got the guy who was running for supervisor when I first started, got him elected. But in the process, met this other woman named Karen Thompson. So Karen and Marilyn and I became kind of this 3 musketeers, political activists. But little did I know that I was going to end up getting divorced. And little did I know that that political experience was going to lead itself to a career for me. So a friend of mine named Cece Wilkins called me one day and said, are you still interested in going back to work? And I said, well, so happens, probably be a good idea. And she said, well, there's this psychiatric hospital down here in Chula Vista, and the administrator asked me if I knew of anybody who would make a good community relations director. And I told him about you, and they want to meet you. And I said, I know nothing about hospitals. I know nothing about psych, except I read Psychology Today. And all I've done is run political campaigns. She said, that's the reason they want you. They want somebody who knows their way through county government. So I show up at Southwood for an interview, but I thought, well, I'll practice interviewing. And the administrator, Mr. Gaines, was this retired general from the Army. He was a black man. And I could tell after an hour and a half that he really liked me because I didn't think interviews were really supposed to last that long. He said, but I want you to meet Dr. Berkman. He's the medical director. We make these decisions together. So I said, okay. So the next Friday, I was to go to meet Dr. Bergman in his office in Mission Valley. But I thought, okay, Dr. Bergman, fat, conservative, 50, Jewish, I better dress appropriately. So I show up at the door wearing boots, a midi skirt, a sweater, my hair long, pulled back, and kind of a gaudy wig, actually, that Roger had given me. So I'm talking with Dr. Bergman, and I could tell he was interested in me too. But then he says to me, he says, Grace, looking at the way you're dressed, do you think you might intimidate some of the parents of the patients we have at Southwood? I said, Dr. Bergman, you make me feel like I should kept on my Democrat shirt and my blue jeans. He said, are you a Democrat? I said, isn't everybody? And he hired me. To this day, Dave Berkman and I are still really good friends. And that was 40-some-odd years ago, 1976. A long time ago. But my time at Southwood became magical for my children. Now, they had grown up campaigning, going out, doing door hangers, going with me door to door, being involved in political events and stuff. So they all had that kind of a background. When I went to Southwood, you see, Aaron would have been 16, yeah. So they all kind of got sucked up into the system. I mean, and all of the picnics and the volleyball tournaments and things like that they were all very much a part of. Doug became, he was a regular at everything. Kelly became part of a Lucy psychiatric help 5-cent thing that I did at health fairs. Anyhow, it was just really great. It was a psychiatric hospital is the best place for a newly divorced woman to be, because I had so much mental health support, you couldn't believe it. And a little quirky thing that happened, actually I was dating this guy. He was 10 years younger than me. His name was Jeff. And just really became a good friend. And I lost my nerve and reconciled with Roger for a very brief period of time, about 6 months. And unfortunately, what happened in that process, Roger, if you're watching it, this is it. Before that reconciliation, the 3 kids and I were a super team. We worked together. Everything was just really, really good. But when Roger moved back into the house, the environment changed so drastically. It was a real mistake, a mistake for me, a mistake for my children, quite honestly, because you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. Well, that not working out, decided that we should go our own way, and we did. And then I kind of embarked on a couple of years of being a single woman. I had gone from high school to husband, and I had missed something, I think, and I went back and tried to fill the gap, so to speak. And I did. But then I met a guy named John Micetich. I got involved with the Chamber of Commerce in Chula Vista, which is where it's located. And I mentioned John Micetich. He happened to be an assistant manager at the Wells Fargo Bank in Chula Vista. Well, because I was the second woman to ever sit on the board of the Chamber of Commerce, at our installation dinner, I was dating the guy who was the MC, and I sat up at the main table facing all those other people in the audience. Well, when everybody stood up to say the Pledge of Allegiance, this guy in the middle of the crowd, full beard, full head of hair, and a plaid jacket, and I remembered seeing him thinking, he doesn't look like a chamber guy at all. So then the next month, the chamber had a social mixer, which they often do, and the guy that I was dating a month before was involved with it and stuff. And anyhow, so he had responsibilities, and I'm there. And then these 2 guys come in, and a woman who works with them at Wells Fargo, who'd become a friend of mine. And John was one of them, John Micetich. I looked at him and I said, I remember you. You're the guy from the installation there with the plaid jacket. You don't look like you belong in the Chamber of Commerce. He said, I remember you. You were the lady in the dynamite green dress. And so then we were kind of off and running, and found out he was from Illinois, and he kind of reminded me of Abraham Lincoln. So I asked him 2 questions, like, what is your goal in life? and what do you want in life? And he said, what are you looking for in life? And he said, what I am looking for is truth and beauty. And I roll my eyes and I think, oh boy, what is And I said, so what do you want? He said, I want a relationship with an older woman. But I thought, boy, this guy's full of so much, you know what. And anyhow, so I just thought, oh, well, he's young. He was probably 31. I was 38, much younger than me. And I thought to myself, well, you know, he's kind of an interesting guy, well-educated, well-read. He actually liked his mother, which I thought was kind of good. And so, as the evening went on, everybody kind of, we're talking, and I recruited him to serve on a committee that I was chairing, which was a political action committee that made recommendations for the chamber on their votes, you know. So he said, sure. So anyhow, I didn't have a way to get to the place, the after party, which was going to be at a Black Angus restaurant that had a disco and a bar. And so a bunch of people were going. He said, oh, I'll take you. So I rode over with him, and in the front seat of his car, on the floor, there must have been 24 small cans of spices. And I said, what are those doing there? He says, oh, my friend's moving to Japan, and she's giving me all of those. And I said, oh, well, that's really nice. I said, do you like to cook? He said, oh, yeah. He said, I'm in a gourmet group. I said, you are? He said, yeah. I said, well, that's impressive. And so anyhow, we go to Black Angus, and we're dancing, and I could tell he was kind of, buzzing around. A couple weeks go by, and I'm thinking about this man, and I think, he's really kind of a unique human being. So I called him up and I said, well, what are you doing for lunch? She said, oh, having lunch with you. I said, oh, okay. So I went by the bank, but then he got a call that his dog, Alfie, had escaped once again and was roaming in the neighborhood. So he said, but I gotta go home and get my dog first. So we go to his house on Vista Street, get his dog, lock him up, and then we go have lunch. Well, I had never been to Kensington before, and I thought, boy, this is really a cute place. Anyhow, so we just started being buddies and hung out together. And my first Thanksgiving as a divorced woman, I accepted an offer from him to go to his friend's house for Thanksgiving dinner without my family, and it totally pissed off my mother. She was so unhappy with me. But I thought, well, if I'm going to be divorced, I might as well figure out what it's all about. But I didn't make anybody else happy. And I went with John to Del Mar, and it was a vegetarian Thanksgiving. He hung out with people like that. And so I had driven, and he had sold his car and was going to be picking up a brand new Honda the next day. So I stayed at his house. I stayed in the den and wore his shirt, went to bed. And I remember just saying, he was in his bedroom, I was in the den, and just saying, good night, John boy, just like the Waltons. And so I took him in the morning and dropped him off to get his cart. And so we started seeing quite a little bit of each other, and he had symphony tickets to the Los Angeles Philharmonic in San Diego, and he'd invite me to go to that. And we'd go have dinner, and I would always insist on paying my own way. And so anyhow, one thing leads to another, right? And we became a couple in December. We had met in July. So I said, every time I go to your house, John, all you have in your refrigerator is eggs and beer. I think it's time we went to the wine country. So I drove, and we went to the wine country, and we're sitting at this winery, having lunch out on the balcony, and I said to him, do you think that the wine country of France looks like this? He says, well, why don't we go find out? I said, well, that's easy for you, see, I can't do that. He says, no, I'll pay your way. And I said, over my dead body. I'm never letting anybody pay my way to Europe. And I said, no, I can't afford it. He said, he was my banker. He said, and I had just bought a condominium. And he said, I know how much money you have, Grace. You've got plenty for a car and a trip and to pay off your bills and still have money left over. I said, okay, then let's go. And that was my first trip to Europe. I was 39 years old. And it was wonderful. It was 3 weeks. It was France and Switzerland and Italy. And it was a magical trip. So from Venice, he had been speaking French and kind of, just making us, get along through the country. So we get to Venice, and he said, well, you're an Italian heritage. You take over. I don't know how to speak Italian. So anyhow, we needed to buy tickets on the overnight train back to Paris. And so I practiced my really roughly Italian, and I went to the train station and asked for 2 tickets at a couchette over the overnight train to Paris. And they gave the choice. It just didn't even cost hardly anything. And I thought, gee, this is really cheap. Well, I didn't realize why it was so cheap until we got on the train, and we're in this car with like 4 other people, and that's where we're gonna sleep that night. And the conductor comes along and asks for our tickets. So I give him our tickets, and he says, oh, no, your tickets. And I says, this is my ticket. He says, no, this is just a reservation for a sleeping couch. You don't have a train ticket. I said, I don't? He said, no. And I said, well, what can I do? He said, well, you can buy your tickets from the first class conductor. I said, okay, how do I do that? He said, well, he's up in that car. I'll take you and I'll show you. So I said, okay, so John, give me some money. So he gives me what we have left. Well, what we had done in Spola. We spent all of our Italian lira, and all we had was French francs. So I meet this guy, and I've forgotten his name now, but he was absolutely charming. And it was obviously interested in practicing his English, because he invited me to sit down and talk to him, say, I would be happy to sell you a ticket, but I don't know how much it will be till we get to the Swiss border. And so I said, well, what currency do I need? He said, you're going to need Swiss currency. I said, I don't have any of that. He said, well, when the train stops at the Swiss border, you jump out, you jump in line, here's a bunch of money. He gave me a bunch of French francs or something. Go in and exchange it. And he gave me all this money. So I go back, I tell John, and I said, we're supposed to wait for, with him to get to the Swiss border. And I said, grab that bottle of wine we bought. So John comes, he said, you deal with it, you're a woman, they kind of like women. So Roger, his name was Roger, which I should have remembered. And so we go to his little place that he sits in. It turns out that he was a huge fan of Dr. Seuss, and he had 2 children. And he used to translate Dr. Seuss books into French for his children. And so we taught literature, we taught politics, and all kinds of things. Get to the French. We get to the Swiss border. I jump out, and all these Italians keep taking cuts in front of me in line. And I think, oh God, I'm going to miss this train. I finally get there, I make the exchange, I come back, I give him the money, and we evened it up somehow. And then we took off again, and we were driving through Switzerland. He's showing us these beautiful places on the hill, that are all lit. And we had an absolutely delightful time. Getting kind of drunk on our wine and his cognac, we go climbing back into our compartment, and then we get to Paris in the morning at the Gare du Nord. So John says, let's just stash our suitcases in these lockers, and we'll go find a place to live, to stay. So we are walking along the Seine, eating our leftovers for breakfast, and we come to the left bank, and we see a sign on a hotel. It says, Hotel California. We said, how appropriate. So it's like, 9 in the morning, we go in and ask if they have 5 nights. So happens they do. So we $17 a night. We get a room plus breakfast, in Paris on the left bank. The room had a bidet and a sink, and everything else you had to go down the hall. And it was utterly romantic and charming, and always has been our favorite hotel. It doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. So my first trip to Europe was in 1979, and you kind of heard the highlights of it. Consequently, we took both Kelly and Doug to Paris, stayed in the same hotel, and then another time Doug went back with us. We stayed at the same hotel, and then it didn't exist anymore, and which was kind of sad. I decided that maybe John was the man, and he wanted me to move in with him to the house in Kensington. Now, I had bought the condominium that has become the Connolly condominium, that everybody in the family has lived in it. But I also had to get the permission from my children, what they thought of John, was okay with them that I was with him and that we might be moving towards marriage. And they were fine. And at the time, Erin was kind of off doing her own thing, and Kelly was still in high school, and Doug was living with his father, with Papa Rogers. So on my birthday, 1980, I moved into Kensington House. And that was really kind of a momentous time. And we were living together. John had had a couple of promotions, and he was a branch manager, but was bored silly with Wells Fargo. In December of that year, he came home from the bank and said, "I've just had the most interesting offer." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, there's this client at the bank. His name is Don Riley. He keeps going back and forth to Saudi Arabia, and every time he comes back, he brings hundreds of thousands of dollars with him for investing in the bank, to deposit in the bank." I said, "Really?" "He'd like me to go to work for him." I said, "What do you mean?" He said he'd like me. He said there's this new thing out called financial planning, and he'd like to get into that because he's been doing just real estate investments, but he wants to broaden up, and he's got permission at a Saudi partner to open a company in Saudi Arabia. And I'd like you, John Micetich, to manage it. And so he was being offered this job to manage Abelco Financial Services in Tehran, Saudi Arabia. I said, "Oh my gosh." He said, "Well, I would go back and forth. I will go for a month and, solicit business, back here for 2 months, back." So 4 times a year I will be going to Saudi Arabia. And in the process, you can meet me on my trips in other places in the world. He said, if I want to go east, we can meet coming back around in Europe. If I want to go west, we can meet in the Orient. I thought, whoa, that sounds pretty cool. And he said, I'll make lots of tax-free money, and Don says I could make well over 100 a year. This is 1980. And I said, I don't want you to take that job. He said, what do you mean? I said, I was always financially dependent on somebody in my marriage, and you and I are on equal footing right now. I said, I own a condo, I own a quarter of a cabin in Julian, and I have a job. I said, you make more money than me, but I have more property than you. All you've had is this house in Kensington. And he said, you know what? I think you could get used to it. So I said, okay. So he takes the job, and he does this, and every couple of months he keeps saying, would you like to go to Saudi Arabia to live? He said, it would be better if you were there and I could stay the whole time. I said, I have a career. I'm very happy with my career. I don't want to go. Well, at Southwood, I got to this point where I'd gone as far as I could go, and I got offered a job by an advertising agency that specialized in healthcare, a guy named John Pinto. So I took the job, And after about 2 or 3 weeks, I realized this was not the move I should have made. And I said to John, I think I'll just freelance. He says, well, if all you want to do is freelance, how do you think now about going to live in Saudi Arabia? I said, oh my goodness, what about that? I said, I have a career. What am I going to do there? He said, would you do for Abelco what you do for all those clients at John Pitto? I said, well, how can I do that? Women are not supposed to work in Saudi Arabia. He said, well, we're moving our offices from the lobby of the Marriott Hotel in Tehran to a villa in Doha. That didn't mean anything to me. I said, what's Doha? He said, oh, it's just all these new houses that Aramco's building for its top executives. And we're renting a villa, and our Sebastian, who's our secretary from India, will help you with whatever you need. But you've got the expertise we need. I thought, oh, okay, but my kids, what about my kids? He said, you've always wanted your children to go to Europe. What we will do is rather than come home with our expatriate money, we'll bring your kids over and we'll take them on 3-week trips of Europe. I said, that sounds really good, John. I said, but if I'm there, I can't drive, I can't ride a bike, I have to wear this kind of restrictive clothing. What if I get really bored and don't know what to do with myself and I get tired of looking at your face? And he says, you can go to Greece for the week. I said, I could? He said, yep. I said, sold. So, made the announcement that I was leaving, and I had all these media contacts, and I let them all know I was going to Saudi Arabia, stay in touch and send us postcards. And my friends threw this big going away party for us in Crown Point. There were 150 people there. And it was just really terrific. I mean, my parents were there and all of our friends, and of course my kids were there. Actually, our good friends, the Coburns, were there with a newborn baby, which is kind of interesting. He's now pushing 40. And so my visa finally came through, and in early December, I flew to Saudi Arabia. And I was a little nervous about it, so I got behind this either British or American couple, got off the airplane, and I stayed really close to them, and got my luggage came, and it went onto the thing, and they opened it up, and all of a sudden, there's John. How did he get in here, you know? And they're going through my luggage. They're looking for contraband. That meaning a Bible or products that are made in Israel that are not allowed. So the secret was to put your fancy underwear on the top, I was told this, on the top of your clothes in your suitcase, because those men don't want to go through them. So they zipper me up. John takes me off. We drive to the place in Doha, and he pours a huge bath of hot water for me. It was a long day. And so we went out and walked in the neighborhood the next morning, and he says, what do you think of this place? I said, it looks like a desolate version of Tijuana. And it was barren. All the houses had huge walls around them. Our villa had 2 entrances of the big walls. One was for the men, and the other on the side was for the women. The house, all the windows in the house were made of frosted glass so that nobody could look in and see the women. Our neighbor to the one side of us was an Arab woman with a couple of small kids. I never saw her face because she was always totally covered in her abaya. But I heard her screaming at her children. So I met Sebastian, who had been a chemistry teacher in India, came with his wife, a nurse, to Saudi Arabia to make money, and they became basically fucking millionaires in India. He was wonderful. He became my best friend, actually, and we would discuss politics and the world events and he was just wonderful. So the problem that a Belco had was that it just had to go through a Ramco, which happens to be the largest corporation in the world, very wealthy, owned by the Saudi family. And they had to get permission to do everything. They had these meetings, and they would send out flyers, and 10 or 15 people would show up occasionally at their little seminars. So I said, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're just going to go right past a Ramco. We're going to rent a hotel room, a big meeting hall. We're going to get a mailing list. I'm going to start a newsletter. We're going to develop a plan, a program called Homeward Bound Retirement Planning, paying off for all those years you spent here. And you're going to give seminars. The first one we had, and I hired buses to get the women to the hotel because they couldn't drive off campus. And there were like 150 people at the first one claiming they'd made reservations when they really hadn't. So we had to turn away about half of them. So the next one, we got a huge hotel room. Over 300 people came. I stood and introduced John and told about his background, which was kind of unlike women are supposed to do. And it was so successful, I walked up to our Arab partner, Ale Bellucci, and I gave him a hug. He came into the office the next day and said, never, ever, ever do that again, because I had broken the taboo. No contact between men and women who were not related. I mean, every time I left without John, I had to sit in the back seat of the car, or our houseboy or Sebastian had to walk behind me and carry my things. I had to wear, I always had to wear long dress, long sleeves, high collar. So he was very upset with me. He says, Grace, I know you're very enthusiastic, but you can't do that here. I learned a lot of humility, but also we became extremely successful. John and I just did a terrific job together. We, in the year we were there, we jumped over our financially over all of our peer group 10 times. Didn't have to pay any taxes. They paid these wonderful vacation trips that where my children got to go. And I got to live in a very exotic, unusual place. When I look back on it, it's the best thing I did for my career, because before we left, I was concerned that my colleagues in public relations were going to just leave me in the dust. What happened was just the opposite. I mean, I could pull out all the stops in marketing there, and if I fell flat in my face, nobody would know it, but instead it was extremely successful. And I became an international citizen. And I came back with so much confidence that I wanted to come back and start the Grace Conley Company. And so, while we were gone, that was part of the dream. Kensington Financial for John, the Grace Conley Company for me, and we used to talk about it. And so the communication with the kids was by an air package would come every week with documents and stuff, and their letters would come to me, and my answers would go back to them. They'd pick them up at the office in Mission Valley at Riley. And so we communicated that way. Erin and Kelly got to live at our house in Kensington for free for a year. It was a beautiful house, and they had to just take care of the dog. Well, one birthday that year, they were going to call me to tell me happy birthday. It would have been the 22nd of June. Halfway through my visit there, and I think after Erin, this was after Erin's trip to Italy and before the other two kids came to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam. They didn't call. And so we called them and we said, you said you were going to call me. What happened? And they both started to cry. I said, what's the matter? They said, we had to put Elfie down. And we were afraid to call because we didn't want to have to tell John. And when John heard that, he just broke down in bawls. And now I'm going to cry. It was the first time I ever saw John cry. And he didn't cry when his father died, but he did when his dog died. And the girls were just heartbroken, and they told us that that he had been dragging his hind legs and couldn't walk, and they knew he was in pain. And the vet had said that had to be done. John, of course, understood. He was a German Shepherd that had hip displacement issues. And so, anyhow, we got through that. And then we just said to Kelly, well, we will see you in a few weeks in Amsterdam. And so we did. We saw Doug and Kelly. And then we did Holland and Belgium and had some wonderful experiences. We were in France and Switzerland and went to all the wine areas in France and just had a great time with them. And it was a wonderful experience for them too. So come end of the year, I changed my body. I was so bored, I didn't know what to do with myself. So we bought me one of those round trampolines, those little ones. So I'd run on it for 30 minutes or 90 minutes. Then I'd do the Jane Fonda workout. And then I'd walk around. I mean, I had nothing else to do except a few things that I did for the marketing that didn't take all that much time, really, once we got going. I lost 25 pounds, and I came back a size 8. Oh, it shows you what boredom can do for you. So somebody said to me a funny thing. They said, there's no such thing as being too fit or too rich. And I laughed, and it was a bumper sticker kind of a thing. But we came back, and we came through London and had 5 days in London that were just magnificent. And because we were cash rich, well, there's no place to spend money in Saudi Arabia. You just make it. We went on a spending spree. We bought Waterford Crystal, we bought cashmere sweaters, we bought high-end clothes. I bought this Oscar Scutum raincoat outfit that's basically Burberry, but it's Harrods version. I bought a bag full of Christmas ornaments from Harrods and for gifts. I mean, we were living high on the hog. We really were. And so we came back through Chicago and stayed with John's sister and his mom, and caught up with her new baby. And then we arrived home before Thanksgiving and got to have Thanksgiving with our family and Christmas with our family. And it was just fabulous, but ended up being an incredible year. So that was 84. And of course, it had been my dream to start my company. And so in January, I launched the Grace Conley Company with a rented typewriter and an answering service in my little back room that was off the kitchen, wearing slippers and a warm robe. And I made a few contacts, and I started getting referrals like you wouldn't believe. I mean, this one guy calls me and said, I've got a client. He wants to know if I know anybody in the oil industry. The only person I could think of was you because of your time in Saudi Arabia. So I referred you. So I meet this guy, Mr. Grant, and he hires me to do a brochure on his oil drilling company in Pennsylvania. So I do a nice job for him. He gives me other work. I do some work for his wife. I get a referral to a developer down in the South Bay. He becomes my client. I hire a graphic designer. And all of a sudden, I'm off and running. And we wrote everything off the Grace Conley Company because in May, John separated from Riley because he said to Don Riley, I don't think commission-oriented sales is ethical. It's not fair to the clients. And I think we should get into this new field called fee-only planning. So Don fired him. So John started Kensington Financial in May, and then I guess he launched it pretty close to the end of the year. But in that period of time, I was the wage earner, first time ever, just me. And we bought a new Mercedes, not brand new, used Mercedes. All this office equipment, we rented an office, we wrote it all off against the Grace Conley Company, which still ended up with a $10,000 taxable income. I did really well. Surprised the living daylights out of me, out of myself. And so then with John, he got 25 of Riley's best clients to come with him because they liked his approach of fee-only planning, and his company was off and running. So, it was just a great adventure that really worked to our advantage. So when we came back, and he had his company going, he had a chance to teach financial planning at University of California, San Diego at their School of Extended Studies. And so for 16 years, every Monday night, he was teaching there. And then he kind of hit on this idea of how he had wanted to give back to his university, the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, which is oddly enough when Roger and the girls and I moved back to Illinois from California, where we spent the summer. Didn't know I'd come back there. So he volunteered to teach an 8-week course pro bono to any student who wanted to take the course. He did that the first year, and it was really successful. And so they extended to 2 courses because they had so many kids who wanted to take it. Well, every year they kept expanding it. And finally, after 3 years, and we're coming back for 8 weeks, 10 weeks at a time, they hired him a full-time job. So he ran Kensington Financial and became a full-time professor at the University of Illinois in the School of Business. And for 10 years, we would leave San Diego in January and go back to Illinois where it was freezing cold. And the end of the semester was in May. So the last year that he taught, we decided that we would not come back to San Diego. We had rented out our house, another house that happened to be in the neighborhood we live in now. And we moved to London for 6 months. And we lived in an area called Islington. And John had decided that he wanted to write a book about London, a travel book about the kinds of places that tourists didn't know about. So he was researching, and we were traveling all over the place. Doug and Vicky came to visit us, my son and his wife. Our friends, the Coberts, came. Our friends from Champaign, the Sinos, came. And luckily we had a 2-bedroom house that we could put them in. And it was a wonderful 6 months. At the end of it, we took off and traveled into Scotland and all around the rest of England, ending up coming home after being gone for almost a year. So it was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful experience. That would have been 2000 and, can't remember, in the early 2000s. But what I forgot to say about 1984, when we were in Saudi Arabia, remember I was kind of bragging about how fit I got? Well, not having anything to drink, alcohol like wine, added to it. But I want to tell you the story about how the Saudis live. Not the Saudis, the Americans living in Saudi Arabia. There are 10,000 Americans working for Aramco at that time. And it was like, if you were on, it was called the camp, it was like going on an Air Force town in Colorado. It was just, you couldn't tell you were in Arabia. My first couple of days there, we got invited to a Christmas party. Actually, it was a 12th night party, come to think of it, by the lead attorney for Saudi Arabia, who made lots of money and lived very nicely, an American man. And we walk in, and my head did a spin. I saw this giant Christmas tree, and behind the Christmas tree with these big glass windows, there were palm trees and a swimming pool. And walking throughout the room, there were these Indian men clad in white Nuru type jackets, going like this with trays of alcohol, and they came up to you and then they say, would you like a white madam or a brown madam? Meaning a white liquor or a brown liquor. And I asked John later, I said, where does that come from? He said, oh, they all make it. All of these engineering type people built stills and secretly made alcohol in their garages, and some ran it enough that it was decent enough to drink and some didn't, and I have to tell you, it tasted awful. But every now and it was illegal, naturally. So every now and then, the Aramco, at the behest of the Saudi government, would launch raids on the homes of the engineers where they suspected they had these stills. And then when all of these engineers get word that this raid is coming, they'd pick up their stills, put them in the backs of their cars, drive to the desert and bury them. And so then after the Saudis could not find any stills, they gave up, and the doctors, the dentists, the engineers all drove back to the desert, picked up unburied their stills and brought them back and went right back into business. It was some of the worst tasting stuff I've ever had, but they were desperate. And some people even made wine. And John and I attempted the same thing. I want to get back to this story because it's interesting. One of the engineers told us how to do it. We bought a big empty 5-gallon water jug, like from watercolor. We bought Welch's grape juice, a huge bag of sugar, and yeast, and this little thing called that they gave. Oh yeah, and you mixed it all in this jug, right? And then you add a little bit of water, and then you get from one of the engineers, you get this plug that you put into the top of the bottle, because pretty soon the yeast starts to take effect and it starts to ferment and it bubbles and it booms it. This stuff that we did in our bathroom, which had 3 toilets, and it had a hammam, a squatting toilet, had a bidet, and a western toilet. So we put wood over the eastern, the hammam it's called, put our bottle on it, and pretty soon the thing is spitting all over the room. I believe we've got red coming all over the walls and stuff like that. The same Arab owner who chastised me for hugging him came over one day and he says, I smell alcohol. You know that that's not allowed in this country. And so, anyhow, so John and I bottled it and put limbs on it and called it Chateau Micetich and took it to people's houses for dinner. But I hadn't want to let that experience go back without sharing it with everybody. Okay, so then we're no longer in Saudi Arabia, come home through London. 1985, we launched our businesses. And I think I said how well mine did, and John's did well. To this day, John still has most of those clients. Unfortunately, in the last 5 years, last year, we lost 5 of them. 2 for cancer, 2 from old age, and 1 ended his life because he had developed, we think, beginning ALS, and he didn't want his family to go through that. But he's lost. That's the only way his clients either die or they die. They don't want him to retire. They don't want him to die. They said, we need you. Well, he's going to be 78 years old. And there's a point where he's going to want to really cut back even more. But they need him, and he needs something to do, so that's it. But in the process of all those years together, we became humongous travelers in many different ways. We've been to 37 countries, including Asia and the Orient and all of Europe, only in South America to Peru. So one of the things we started doing that interested us was home exchanging with European families. And we have done that with a family in Germany, and it was called Saarbrücken, Germany, and we happened to be flying on the 23rd or 4th, it would have been, of February of 2000, when Gwendolyn was being born, the person who's hosting this little conversation that we're having. And we arrived in Saarbrücken, and they said, "You have a telephone call from your son who'd like you to return it." And then he told me that Gwendolyn had been born. And so I understand that the labor nurse kept asking Doug, "Well, where's your mother?" He said, "She's flying to Germany tonight," as we speak. And he said, "Well, why is she doing that?" Well, it's the kind of thing they do. So anyhow, that was the day that Gwen was born. Also, when Andrew was born, Doug and John and I were together in Spain, and I had called Erin to see how she was doing. And she said, "Oh, we're fine. We're going to have a picnic and go to the museum." That's good. So then that night, Douglas gets invited by the son of the owner of this cafe. We were staying above it. And he said, "Do you want to go out and to go dancing and meet some girls?" And Doug, who's 16, says, "Sure." So he says, "Meet me at the restaurant at 1:30, like 1:30 in the morning." So Doug goes off with him to some disco where all the girls had been coming off of the yachts that were there. He said, very rich girls who weren't looking for a naive 16-year-old American boy. So, but it was an experience for him. And I would say that some of our favorite things have been more recent because we've been to so many countries a number of times, both China and Japan. And we thoroughly enjoyed both of those very, very much. And so that, we've been around. But getting back to the home exchanges and the renting of houses, I think we home exchanged in Germany twice, Norway, what other country now? I can't remember. Oh, in England. We got into also renting homes in France. And I want to tell you about the first one. We rented it for a month, and it was in a place called Romanèche-Touraine, which was in Beaujolais, and just below the Burgundy border. And we rented this incredibly wonderful house. And we were there for 4 weeks, and each week, friends would come in and stay with us. The first week it was Terry and Cece, two single women, and John's friend and cardiologist, Lee Sprinkle, and his wife. The next week it was my old boss from Southwood and his wife, their son who had just graduated from college. And the next week after that was Karen Lee Robinson and her then husband Richard. And the last week was Dr. David Bergman, my first boss, and his then girlfriend, Gretchen. And it was party scene. I mean, every time somebody gets to France, they say, all that wine, whoopee, and we happened to be like a half a block from this big winery, and if we ran out of wine, somebody would go buy another case. And one night, I will never forget this, Dave Bergman, it was the last week, and we ran out of wine on a Sunday afternoon. We had started drinking probably about 3 o'clock. And it was 6 o'clock, and Dave said, "We need more wine." And John said, "Well, that winery is, it's a very famous one. I can't remember the name right now. It's closed. It's Sunday night, 6 o'clock. Dave said, no, come on, let's go." He'd had enough wine that he was powered. So he and John go. Dave pounds on the door, and they open the door. He said, "I came all the way from California just to buy wine at your winery." So they let them in. They bought a case of, it was a white wine. I think it may have been a Sancerre, $5 a bottle. They come back with 12 bottles. We finished the whole damn case of wine. The next morning, everybody's a little rocky, but Dave Borgman is green, and he had had so much to drink that he was the most severely hungover person I have ever seen in my life. And anyway, he didn't die, but it was just a magical time. But I want to tell you about something very specific that happened on the time that we were in France, a time before this one, 1988. And our friend Terry Mendez is with us, and she and John and I are traveling together, and it's just pouring down rain, and we're looking for some place to stay, and we found this wonderful chateau. We stayed the night there, and the next day we wanted to go to a place called Vézelay. And so we left the chateau and we drove to Vézelay, getting there just about lunchtime. And Vézelay has this magnificent cathedral on the hill with beautiful view, very historic, goes back to about the time of the Second Crusades. And we're walking up the streets to the top of the hill, and we get to the front door, and it's locked. And we thought, well, maybe it's lunchtime. So we walk back around the back of the chateau, or the cathedral, and there's a gravel path coming up towards the chateau, and to the left, there are these large, round granite discs that are like tables. And John and Terry are off somewhere, and I'm by myself. And I just sort of feel pulled towards this table. And I put my hand on it, and something just shoots through me. I am overtaken with grief. I'm shaking. I'm crying. I have no idea what happened. I go over and I sit down on this bench and I think, Gracie, get a hold of yourself. Your imagination's carrying you away. So I thought, I'll tell John about this later. So I enter the cathedral by a side door. John goes down one aisle, Terry the middle one, and I take the right aisle. I come back around the back of the altar, which has small little niches. I come around the back of the altar, and I'm about halfway between, I'm right even to where this happened to me. The same thing hits me. Boom. And I'm quite shaken. And I'm thinking, I have no idea what this is about. So I hot-foot it to the back of the cathedral, and there are brochures about this cathedral, only one in English, so I grab that. I go into the bookstore and the gift store next to the cathedral, kind of looking for something that might tell me more about what happened to me or whatever. But the brochure, all it said was that, it was the site of the Second Crusades, very mystical things happened there, and that it's very historic. So I tell John about it that night. And he said, wow. So we have no way to research it, and we don't have cell phones or anything. But I get back to the States, and it sticks in the back of my mind. And a friend was going to visit this psychic up in Harmony Grove and invited me to go with her. She and another woman. And it was Pearl Smith was this woman's name. So I went. And I was the last one to see her. She's a very old, wrinkled up woman, very religious, very devout. And she does nothing but chastise me, shaking her finger at me, saying, you are truly blocking your spiritual self. You have got to unleash it, and you have to explore it, or you'll be sorry. And I came back out, and I asked Betty and this other gal, I said, she kind of, chide you about anything? They said, no, it was just normal with us. It was just talk to us. And I said, well, okay. Well, anyhow, I couldn't get over that. And I decided that I would start seeking out people who were like that. And each one of them who would say, give me something that you were wearing, and I would give them my ring, they all told me the same thing. They said, you were called back to a place where you experienced your death in another lifetime. They all kept telling me the same thing. And I thought, I don't know. So finally, I met this woman who was very corporate looking, and she was a psychic. And I asked, I said, do you do past life regressions? She said, yes, I do. So I booked her for 3 of them. There were a couple of hours each. And she took me back to that time. And I encountered a Catholic priest who was me. And he had been actually, so that she worked me backwards to where he began. And he was just a very devout young man who lived in Belgium, who had his father was some kind of an engineer who built roads, probably dirt roads, and a sister. And they had a fire in their barn, and he and his sister were told to go get the animals out. Well, he got the animals out, and she did not come out. She died. He then decided that he must find a spiritual life to repay his guilt for her. So he becomes a novitiate or whatever you are, and he starts to travel, and he is assigned to reach this church in France. And so he treks this whole way on foot, of course, and he gets to this church. But he has been very moved by his own experiences of talking to people, to poor people, to peasant farmers. And what he's beginning to see is that the government, meaning the king, is taxing all these people so severely that they can barely live. But he's using the money for his own life and building chateaus and castles and fighting in a crusade. And he takes the side of the peasants, the farmers, and organizes them. He puts notices on trees in the forest, recruiting anybody who will help them. And this new young priest comes to the church whose name is Paul. And Paul is as concerned as he is about the plight of the farmers, and they organize them to resist paying taxes. There's a lot of bloodshed and wars and stuff. But the bishop thinks that, his name is André, by the way, that André needs to be gotten rid of. So they start plotting to get rid of him. And in one of the scenes that I see of him, in one of the subsequent experiences, there are 2 men with these leather masks eyes, but they only cover this part of them, and they're waiting behind that place to stab him when he's out walking on his nightly vigil. And they're ready to kill him. But all of a sudden, his mother superior calls to him, and he turns around and returns to talk to her. I'm seeing all of this in my mind's eye. I'm being hypnotized. This is how this is happening. And so he leaves with her, but the mission's not been accomplished. So the bishop has a sister whose name is Bertha, and she comes to work at the cathedral as the cook. And what they do is they slowly poison him. At this point in my regression, I get this pain, horrible pain in my side, and I start to cry. So the therapist brings me back. She has ways of getting you out of that. So the last session, we explore how he dies. I'll go back to tell you about the other lies too. But he's slowly being poisoned, and I see him, I'm riding above him, and I see this shallow, breathing white man who's, you could tell, is dying. And Paul is next to him, holding his hand. And he is telling Paul, you've got to succeed, you need to continue. And then he dies. That is how they got rid of him. I died. I suspect that that was my first incarnation, but in the other regressions, the first person who actually came to me was my own grandmother, Rachel. I see these two Dutch girls walking along, and I don't know, because every time I start, my nose is like this, the cobblestones. I'm right on the ground, and it takes a while for me to come up. And I see like a curb and some metal bars, and then I see the backs of two dresses and the backs of heels, and two women are walking. And as my vision keeps coming up, I see these two young women. I follow them, and they go into a store. It's my grandfather Toppin's store. And they're talking to him, and he's actually a very jovial guy. And of course, I never met him. I never met her either. But he gives them each a piece of candy, and then they leave. I see her again sitting on suitcases at the dock before they leave for America. And she's very sad. She doesn't really want to leave Holland, the Netherlands. And, but I later saw her in another session when she was very, very unhappy. And my grandfather was not much of a husband. He provided, but that was it. And she was very different than him. And I never saw her die in any of my progressions. But anyway, one day, I was sitting talking to my father in his living room in Lemon Grove. And I decided I'd try something with him. I said, Dad, I have something to tell you. I don't know how you're going to react to this, but I believe I was your mother in another life. He looked at me and he cocked his head. He says, Gracie, that does not surprise me. I was shocked by his reaction. Something I knew at the time, that he was very proud that I was his daughter. I mean, during those years. And that was really an interesting experience. I encountered two other lives also in the regressions. A male barrister in London, and a young girl who was adopted. Her name was Helen, who became very wealthy by marrying rich men. But that Basileus really was starting it. So when we were wedding to all the drunk friends of ours at that house in France, John and I, for my birthday, drove back to Baisley. And I visited the church. We went late in the day so there wouldn't be so many tourists. And I went down in the crypt, I went in the church. I didn't feel anything. So I went out into the courtyard and I did a meditation. I had been learning meditation through my regressions too. And I'm there meditating, and all of a sudden in my mind's eye, that Mother Superior appeared to me. And I said, well, I am here, but I don't know why I have been brought here. And she looked at me and she said, you have come here to find your own truth. And it was as if everything came full circle, because I'd been writing a book about it, talking to people about it, and all of a sudden the mystery was solved for me. It was the beginning of my spiritual search. And I believe very fervently in reincarnation. It got taken out of the Bible. It used to be there. But in the thing of Constantinople, they took it out. It was a political battle, kind of like the Gnostic Gospels. So anyhow, that was quite a momentous experience and changed me entirely. But I started seeing psychics more often for like touch-ups. One time I went and I asked this woman, she lived in La Jolla, about my children. And she couldn't get much about the girls, but she said, but your son, I know something about your son. And she proceeded to tell me that in Doug's future, he would move to the north, he would get a job working outdoors, wear something like a uniform. He would meet a woman from Boston who had a small child who had an allergy and was allergic to milk. So I told Doug this story. It's like the funniest thing. Well, after that, Doug had this broken engagement, and in order to kind of get away from her, he wanted to borrow $1,000 from John so he could go to Oregon. And John said, no, I'm not lending you the money. I'm giving it to you, so go. And so Doug went to Oregon, but that didn't work. And I called him and I said, you know what? We should have called Hank, who owned a winery in El Dorado County, Northern California. And I called Hank, and Hank said, have him call me. So Doug did, and Hank said, come on down, Doug. I could use the help. And so Doug went back, and El Dorado County is between San Francisco or Sacramento and South Lake Tahoe, and it's near a town called Cool. I suggested to Doug that he call Hank, and Hank hires him. And when Doug is at the winery, he meets this woman whose name is Cheryl. And Cheryl's quite enchanted with him, thinks he's wonderful, and she says to him, you know what, if my daughter wasn't married, you'd make a great husband. I'd like you too, but you're too young for me. But anyhow, so then she invites Vicky to come to an event at the winery, and Doug and Vicky meet. And instant like boy, quite attraction. And so they get involved, and for some reason, Doug is telling Vicky about his mom and her past life experiences and stuff, and Vicky's very interested in this sort of thing. So he tells her about the prediction that the psychic made about him and his life going north and meeting a woman from Boston whose son is allergic to milk. And Vicky looks at him and she said, I'm from Boston and my son has a milk allergy. And they look at each other, and I'm sure shivers transferred between the two of them. Maybe that had something to do with it. Who knows? But they fell in love and they got married. And then they had a daughter named Gwendolyn Grace. So, at any rate, so Doug stayed at the winery for quite a while, and then when she was born, became a stay-at-home dad. And just wonderful time in his life. And as I talked about the travels, when I turned 70 in 2010, I decided I wanted my whole family to come to Italy and experience what my mother's heritage had been. So Joan and I had been to this village of Radicondoli and stayed with friends of ours who bought it a number of years ago. We'd been 3 or 4 times. And that's what I wanted to do. So I bought 3 airplane tickets and rented a 5-bedroom house in Radicondoli, and everybody came over except Kelly and Annie, because Annie had an accident and couldn't come and injured her knees and was on crutches. So they couldn't join us. But it was Erin and her then boyfriend Dave and her son Andy, the entire Conley family, including Truman and Gwendolyn and John and me. And we just had a marvelous time. And, it was just a great experience for everyone. And they got it was marvelous. There's a book with the pictures of it that is quite nice.
That was special. And then actually, after that, John had started teaching at the U of I, and we were going back and forth. But in between all of that, in 2006, when we moved to a new house, and I think in 2008, we took 2 Windstar cruises with Doug and his wife, Vicki, who had never traveled outside of the United States. And our first trip together with them was to Istanbul, Turkey. And Vicki arrives at Istanbul about midnight time, and I'm waiting for them in the hotel. And they come trudging in with their backpacks, and Vicki's eyes are like the size of saucers. She said, "This place is great." So that was quite a big jump. It was a very exotic city. And we were off and running. And that cruise we took, we ended in Athens. We went through the Greek islands. We went again with a larger group of friends from Rome to Venice. And then when Gwendolyn was 18 and just out of high school, we had another cruise from Barcelona to Lisbon. So we have been travel companions. But the thing is that when we mention who are our friends, Doug and Vicki are listed as friends, not just family. Unfortunately, when Kelly and Paul broke up, that friendship kind of went by the side. I'm sorry about that, because Kelly's not a part of our life like she used to be when she was with Paul. And Erin has always had all these different husbands and a different life and different boyfriends, and her life's been more tragic than it has been good. And but she's doing fine now. She's finally just doing fine. She's 64 and she's being a great grandmother. And as for me, I hang out with John. We still travel, not as much as we used to. And we tend to do Christmases here if we can, because everybody can gather, or Thanksgivings because we have the space, but nobody else has the room. And we've become kind of the center for that. John survived cancer. We had COVID for 2 years, then he had cancer, and he's fine now. He came out of it real well. I'm perfectly healthy. I break things, shoulders, hips, that kind of stuff, but I come back. And life is good. We have a great grandchild. That's a nice thing. And best of all, we have a relationship with the granddaughter who lived so far away, and now she's so close, and she's so special. Thank you, Gwendolyn. And that's it.